Okay, so first thing that kind of comes to mind, you're taking a very unique approach of building a blockchain and securing it with Bitcoin. So how did that come about? And then how is that different from other blockchains like Rootstock or Riff, who also have been trying to build on top of Bitcoin?
Yes. So I think it might be worth spending a little bit of time here. I would say that this question is probably one of the most fundamental questions in crypto. And a lot of people face that, right? Like I'll give you my example, like back in 2013, when we were looking at, this additional functionality that was not there in Bitcoin, we almost had like, a couple of choices. One is that you try to somehow add that functionality to Bitcoin, right? Similar to how even Vitalik started trying to propose smart contracts on top of Bitcoin. Soon realized that Bitcoin core developers are not going to do that, and he went off and built Ethereum, right? And or you try to build on something that has a connection to Bitcoin, like a merged mine chain, like Namecoin used to be around. And I think RSK is similarly in that camp, where their blockchain is merged mined with Bitcoin, and they kind of like try to have almost like a uh, Solidity language or EVM functionality on the merge mine chain, right? Or the third option is that you just basically build a separate blockchain, which is the option that Vitalik took, or some of the new projects that we're seeing these days. They're mostly like almost by default they try to build a disconnected separate chain, right? And we always remained in the camp that we think that there will be a lot of experimentation that will happen on these independent blockchains, but then there might be consolidation down the road, right? And our thesis is that there's a higher probability of consolidation happening around Bitcoin versus consolidation happening on some other ecosystem, right? And taking that lens, the first iteration of our blockchain was actually literally on top of Bitcoin, right? It's like a virtual chain that runs on top of Bitcoin. That's a system that's live today, but it's a fairly limited system compared to Stacks 2.0, which is our master design, which is the thing we've been working on over the last 2-3 years or so. And in the sense that Stacks 2.0 introduces smart contracts around Bitcoin, right? So I think that's the key thing. That smart contracts is the functionality. Like imagine all of the different types of applications like decentralized exchanges or lending protocols or all the innovation that's happening. It's mostly enabled by having smart contracts directly as a feature on a blockchain, right? So which Bitcoin doesn't have, and for good reason it doesn't have that. But I do think there's a place for that to enable it in a more secure manner so that you're not compromising the security of the base layer, but are adding it as almost like a separate thing next to Bitcoin.
Okay, now how does this compare with other projects that are trying to tackle the same issue?
Yeah, so I think in terms of a mental model, I would say that think of Stacks 2.0 as almost like ETH 2, but just like ETH 2 would kind of like depend on ETH 1, we depend on Bitcoin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And similar to kind of like ETH 2, where people can stake and earn ETH or ETH 2, depending on if you think it's a different token. Over here, if you're participating in consensus and you're locking up STX, you're actually earning Bitcoin, which is a very interesting property of the asset, because I think it's the first asset where if you lock it in consensus, you actually earn another asset, and that it's not just any other asset; it's actually Bitcoin. And I think a lot of people view Bitcoin as being valuable, and they want to earn more of it, right? So that's kind of like one difference. The other thing is like if you take a step back, I would think that the biggest or the hardest thing that any cryptocurrency would face is the fight to be a reserve currency or a sovereign money, right? And Bitcoin in my mind is like far ahead. Also because of like the way it was launched, the kind of community it attracted, the things like fixed supply and some of the other characteristics of Bitcoin make it probably the best suited crypto asset that can be sovereign money, right? And sometimes we see that kind of like play out in the ecosystem where people are saying ETH is money, or some other project is trying to become money. I would say trying to become money is probably the hardest thing. So we don't compete with Bitcoin over there, right? So we're not saying that Stacks is going to be money or Stacks is going to be a sovereign currency. We accept Bitcoin as the sovereign currency, and we add the additional functionality where Stacks can be used within smart contracts around Bitcoin, right? So in some ways, it's a more limited scope, and the asset actually grows in harmony with Bitcoin instead of trying to compete with it, right? Whereas,
Yeah. Now,
yeah,
we know there are lots of Bitcoin maximalists out there. How do you kind of appease them by launching a blockchain building on top of it with its own cryptocurrency?
yes. So I think there's definitely a spectrum, and there are some people who are effectively like there should be just one asset and no other asset. But if you start having a discussion with them, the Bitcoin maximalist would be of the view that they view Bitcoin as a measure of true value, right? But they think that the dollar should be priced against Bitcoin, or other types of commodities should be priced against Bitcoin because their real value should be measured against Bitcoin, right? Versus anything else, right? So if you play that out, Stacks is actually one of the first cryptocurrencies, or the first cryptocurrency that effectively has a price pair against Bitcoin natively on the Bitcoin blockchain itself. The main pair comes from how mining is done, and people mine the chain by using Bitcoin as proof of computations, right? So it's almost like a BTC STX trading pair that happens on the Bitcoin chain itself. So STX is natively priced in Bitcoin, and it's fuel for smart contracts. So what we're saying is we are accepting Bitcoin as a reserve currency, and our price on the Bitcoin blockchain is the most precise measure of what is the value of our asset, right? And if you play that out, you should have more assets that effectively accept Bitcoin as like, hey, my base price pair is represented in Bitcoin. And then you start kind of like getting into other arguments where imagine that, if you hold Bitcoin and you're a Bitcoin maximalist, you don't want to sell your Bitcoin, but you might be interested in taking a USD loan against your Bitcoin holding. And right now, you either have to go to centralized parties to be able to take a loan like that, or you might have to actually use something like wrapped Bitcoin and go to a Ethereum smart contract and try to take a loan that way. Whereas we are enabling that type of functionality through smart contracts directly around Bitcoin, meaning that in a more decentralized way, on a blockchain that is actually secured by Bitcoin, you can take a USD loan out, right? And those things, like once you have a discussion with the maximalists, like they start seeing that. They're like, okay, I would rather take a USD loan through a system like this versus going to Ethereum or versus going to a central company and using that instead.
All right, sounds good.